So thank you, everyone. I'm delighted to be here, and as with many of us, I'd like to begin by acknowledging that I'm speaking to you today from the lands of the Ngunnawal and Ngambri peoples. Acknowledge their elders past, present and emerging, and indeed acknowledge the elders of the many peoples whose lands I've walked on while conducting my research. So today, I'd like to talk about fire, very on brand. Bushfire, human fire, and its relationship to violence. As a fire historian, I think of fire as an active agent of history, something that affects and shapes the world around it. Yet attempts at fire history pretty quickly reveal, as we've already spoken about today, that the terms bequeathed by Australian English are manifestly inadequate to convey the Australian experience of fire. The term bushfire is frustratingly generic. The term unnatural can be wrong. Fire imagery and fire language is dominated by portrayals and metaphors of violence, militaries and monsters. It's so pervasive that even firefighters who are ideologically committed, explicitly committed to using fire ecologically, will casually use antagonistic and militaristic language at odds with their ideological commitments. Destruction is so often the default, yet those like myself who have witnessed a cool burn, a deliberately provocative oxymoron, know that fire can be peaceful, can trickle through the landscape. The story of fire is not just one of destruction. Furthermore, even the legacy of destructive fire can be complex. So these photos come from my friend, Dr. Michael Doherty at the Fenner School of the ANU, from some plots he had running at the time of the 2003 Canberra fires. So you can see there how some vegetation has bounced back from those particular fires. We know that Australia is a continent of fire. It gets repeated ad nauseum. We know that our biota, much of the biota is adapted in some ways to fire, whether that's evolutionarily or behaviourally. So we can see the photo here on the left of the fire kites of Northern Australia, species of birds. They carry burning twigs to unburnt areas in order to feed off the insects fleeing the blazes. So how can we distill a narrative from this vast continent, from destruction and renewal, from our inadequate language? Are bushfires violent? I think it helps to think of fire not just, or not as just fire. Historians and ecologists might talk of fire regimes, patterns in space and time, where we talk about the intensity of fire, how frequent it is, what time of year it occurs at. Are bushfires violent? The work of Tom Griffiths and others, including, as I understand, to soon be featured at the National Museum of Australia, has shown us the magnificent mountain ash forests of Victoria require fire. Mountain ash, as a species, promotes fire. It has heavy falls of litter. It has open crowns, which allow for updrafts to carry flames. It has flammable oils. It has bark to function as a firebrand. Yet, unlike so many other eucalypt species, mountain ash is unusually sensitive to fires of low intensity. The secret is that mountain ash forests don't need fire, they need fire storms. They have evolved to commit mass suicide every few hundred years. After the 1939 Black Friday bushfires in Victoria, which were absolutely devastating, and I note that today is in fact the American Black Friday sales day, so how's that for timing? After those bushfires, it was noted that some 2.5 million seedlings per hectare germinated of mountain ash. 2.5 million per hectare. But the timing of those high intensity fires is critical to the mountain ash. Too soon, and that reseeding can't happen. Too rarely, and the mountain ash is replaced by rainforests. So it's the legacy of the right destruction can be creation. Yet, we know that firestorms are undoubtedly destructive, especially for humans, as we know from Black Saturday and so many other black or red or ash days. On Black Saturday in 2009 in Victoria, the mountain ash forest roared with flame and in a sense inflicted violence upon us. Yet it's a deep shame that across large parts of Victoria, mountain ash forests may not survive and probably will not survive the too frequent firestorms of the last few decades. Are humans inflicting violence upon the mountain ash forests? Through our ignitions, through our introduced species, through, controversially, our logging practices, through our warming of the planet. Now, I'd like to speculate upon the histories and legacies of violence relating to the human use of fire in Australia. Perhaps the most familiar term for the burning practices of Australia's Indigenous peoples comes from the Welsh archaeologist Rhys Jones, who poetically and provocatively labelled the process of burning fire stick farming, an active process, a deliberate intervention. Since Jones, more scholars, more Indigenous practitioners have extended the understandings of Indigenous burning. As this list shows, and as a much longer list I have at home shows, fire was used and is used for a bewildering array of purposes. You can sort of roughly divide those into material purposes, such as to extend grassland, as in Rhys Jones's original theory of fire stick farming, and for non-material purposes, such as out of a cultural obligation to clean country. And distinguishing different purposes can be a bit arbitrary. To my mind, the most poetic description of Indigenous burning, however, comes from the Gogoni speaker and Indigenous fire scientist Dean Yibabuk, who says most people know fire as something very dangerous that can destroy the environment or habitats or buildings or people. But the secret of fire in our traditional knowledge is that it is a thing that brings the land alive again. When we do burning, the whole land comes alive again. It is reborn. So we don't necessarily see fire as bad and destructive. It can be good and it can bring the country back to life. And if you'd like to read more, for those at home or those who are here today, on Indigenous burning practices in the words of Australia's Indigenous people, this is a good place to start, this new book by Victor Stephenson. So we know, I've established that fire was used for lots of different purposes, but what was the effect of that fire? ANU historian Bill Gamage argued in The Biggest Estate on Earth that the greatest ally of Indigenous peoples was fire. While I have quibbles with the extent of his thesis, let's look in depth at one particular central plank to Gamage's argument, that Indigenous Australians used fire to shape vegetation according to systematic templates. We can see in this colonial artwork a sawtooth shape in the trees there. See how the trees stretch out as a sawtooth shape. Hunters can be concealed in the points of the saw, while kangaroos are attracted to freshly burned and nutritious new grass. This is the template in action. But as we know, colonisation brought new people to Australia with their own cultures of fire, and there was conflict. For instance, in the southwest of Australia, the Noongar peoples burned in summer, the period of highest fire danger, as they developed sophisticated skills in burning. They knew the prevailing winds, they knew what time of day to burn, and they'd shaped the vegetation in order to prevent fires or minimise the danger of fires getting away. Colonisation disrupted these burning patterns. At times this was direct, such as through the 1847 Ordinance to Diminish Dangers Resulting from Bushfires. European settlers had been, or some of them had perceived this burning as threatening their crops. Under the ordinance, anyone who set fires in summer was fined £50, except Aboriginal Australians who would face 50 lashes. Many Noongar were thus imprisoned on Rottnest Island for repeatedly lighting fires and fulfilling their cultural obligations to clean country, which is something to keep in mind if you ever visit the island to see the cute quokkas. This was a deliberate suppression of Indigenous environmental and cultural systems to maintain settler environmental and economic systems. So we can think of the ordinance as causing direct violence, in a sense. There was also indirect violence related to fire. In Victoria, Aboriginal Australians fertilised murnong, yam daisy, through a very careful and regular pattern of fire. The introduction of European sheep and cattle saw the cattle eat the murnong, but leave behind shrubby seeds, causing explosive growth of those shrubs, especially in the Western District of Victoria, where acacia and colitis took over. The carefully maintained plains, which interspersed tree, grass and murnong, became overrun by sheep and by scrub. The result was uncontrollable bushfire, and the consequence was the fiery destruction of Indigenous food sources. Indirect violence, in a sense. The effects of colonisation, the legacies of this violence on Indigenous burning and on Indigenous culture are ongoing. Some have argued that the devastating bushfires since 1788, Red Tuesday, Black Friday, Ash Wednesday, Black Saturday, and now the Black Summer, are a direct consequence of the suppression of Indigenous burning practices. We saw that repeated ad nauseum over the last summer. But beyond that, Indigenous academics today, such as Miami Eckford Williamson and Vanessa Kavanagh, have pointed out that much of the coverage of the most recent bushfires focuses on economic destruction, dollar signs, acres burned, and so on, but doesn't incorporate the profound sense of what we might call ecological and cultural grief. Is that an ongoing legacy of colonial violence? But again, the story of fire is not just a story of destruction. Across large stretches of territory in Northern Australia, Aboriginal landowners light early dry season fires to reduce the fuel available for high intensity late dry season fires. In this way, the overall amount of greenhouse gas emissions released is reduced, and these Aboriginal landowners get paid for doing this. So we can see here in the graph on the right of my screen there, these patterns of fire as they have shifted in Western Arnhem Land. So the red there represents late high intensity dry season fires. The green represents the early season low intensity fires. The graph is showing a shift in fire regimes caused by these sorts of programs which are going on, which is closer to what the Arnhem Land biota is used to. And then increasingly, we hear more and more about cultural burning, Indigenous burning in the southern states of Australia, where land tenure may not be held as much by Indigenous peoples. On the right there is Wiradjuri man Dean Freeman, who works with the ACT Parks and Conservation Service. On the left is one of the big figures of the Victorian cultural burning movement, taking a comparative tour of the US. And indeed, cultural burning is present in the US and Canada and elsewhere, though I don't think anywhere near as prominent as in Australia. You can see how that fire on the left there is just trickling along, just trickling down the slope, really slow. Laws are relaxing on Indigenous burning now. It's happening slowly, it's happening patchily, much like a cool burn, trickling away unevenly, almost so you wouldn't notice. Aboriginal members join a New South Wales Bushfires Advisory Council. Governments provide training funding for cultural burning. Private landholders are inviting Indigenous traditional owners onto their land, and they listen and they learn. So to conclude, we can see that fire shapes history, both directly and indirectly, through its presence, through the particular patterns of its presence, and through its absence. The legacies of fire continue to affect us today, but the narratives of fire are complex. There's irony, as we can see in this photo. We can't quite see it here. That was taken over the summer. So from that angle outside the Coombs building, you should be able to see Telstra Tower. But ANU is a smoke-free campus. There's irony with fire, but there's also hope. Thank you.